Thank you, Ben. This time we'll call on Dr. Rodney Guliuzza.
Thank you so much, Ben. That's really a joy to listen to you play. You do it from the heart. Well, I was just talking with your sister right before we came up, and she mentioned that she's so thankful that I was here and was able to present some material that she can share with her grandkids. And I hope she says that after this talk. So this one is going to be a little more challenging than the prior talks. It's to stretch you a little bit. Some of you folks have come from far and wide, and some of you are regular students of creation. So you want to hear something new. You want to hear something different. You want to hear something that's going to set you on to a better path of truth, and that's hopefully what this talk will do. But it is a little more challenging, but don't despair, don't be afraid, don't worry, don't be looking at me right now with this worried look on your face, like, oh no, it's going to be hard science. It won't be hard science. It's just going to be something different. And you guys are all, how many of you have been following creation science for several years? Let me see those hands, all of you. Yeah, look at that. So that means you guys are what? Pretty creation savvy, right? Pretty creation savvy. And since you've got the basics down in your creation savvy, we can go with a little harder topic right now. So in Ephesians chapter 4, it says that God gave pastors and teachers for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ in love, that we be no more, I mean, you know this verse, children tossed to and fro, tossed to. Wow, you wonder what does that? There's always something about the word that brings out opposition. I have a pastor who said, people say Satan is prince and power of the air. That's true, but he's really prince and power of the airwaves. Because he gets into every audiovisual system and messes them up all the time. Okay, we're no longer children tossed what? To and fro, and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the sleight of men. By the what? The sleight of men, whereby they lie in cunning craftiness to deceive. That means that we have an enemy who's pretty clever. Clever, if we were to put this into your own words, clever at what? Tricking us. You ever been tricked before? Of course, and this is a big trick. So there are two explanations for the origin of this universe and the origin of life, and they are God creates nature or nature creates itself. This will be the main topic of today's talk. We're going to flesh out how we Christians and the world lie in deception of this enemy on those two things. And I'll give you a little illustration right from the beginning. Do you remember when we used to launch rockets to the moon? These Saturn V rockets. And we would all watch them taking off. So imagine yourself watching this rocket going up, and I say to you very quickly, it is rising by natural projection. And you say, wow, it's going up by natural projection. Yes, look, it's going up by natural projection. It's being pulled into the sky by natural projection. And you say, yeah, it is. It's going up. And I say, well, can't you see it's working? Natural projection works. It's going up. And you say, yeah, natural projection really does work. And then you turn to me and you say, well, what is natural projection? And I say, well, natural projection is when some volatile gases, which are contained in tanks inside that rocket, are released. And they go into a mixing chamber. And the gases mix. And there's a combustion effect, which ignites those gases. And out through the bottom of a tailpipe comes a massive flame, producing lots of thrust. And that's natural projection. You'd be thinking there, well, wait a second here. It sounds like all you did was describe the innards of the rocket, which is raising itself into the sky, and you gave it a fancy schmancy name that sounds like something's operating on it from the outside, but actually everything is happening from the inside. What would you do if I could convince all of you that it was natural projection acting on the rocket? Acting on the rocket, raising it into the air. And every time you ask me to describe it, I describe what's going on inside the rocket. Well, that's exactly what's going to happen with this. Atheistic or theistic selectionism. We talked about it yesterday, selectionism. I'm going to show that design analysis shows that they're both mystical beliefs. And here's the heads up. Every time, no exceptions, that evolutionists or creationists are going to describe natural selection, they will always describe it in terms of an organism's internal capabilities. But then they're going to use it as if the environment is acting on it, working on it, and influencing it from the outside. That is the sleight. That is the trick. Is to get you thinking that nature is working on creatures when it's actually the outworking of their own internal effects. Now, wouldn't that be pretty clever? That'd be pretty clever. And that's exactly what's happening here. So, in this particular case, we're going to try to identify the true cause or the primary cause of how organisms adjust to their environment. Now, is finding true cause important? You better believe it is. In fact, it's the work of scientists. This is what scientists are really all about. This is Stephen Meyer said in the book Darwin's Doubt. Since the beginning of modern science, scientists have championed a common sense principle of scientific reasoning known as the vera causa. Vera is Latin for true, the true cause. The early modern scientists affirmed this principle as one of the key aspects of the scientific approach to understanding nature. This stood in opposition to the magical thinking that had gone before them, attributing powers to nature that they had never observed it manifesting. In other words, back then they would look at something happening and they would infer it to the gods or some mystical effect, when there was a real natural explanation for it. I'm going to assert today that we need to find the true cause, because people now are still attributing powers to nature that they've never observed it manifesting. And it's all going to go down to agency. This is one. You've seen Stephen Hawking before, purported to be one of the smartest men on the planet. And he said in his book, The Grand Design, because there is such a law as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists and why we exist. What is the succinct way of saying nature creates what? Itself. These are the learning points. Nature creates itself versus God creates nature. And this, I'm telling you, good brothers and sisters, this is the battle. This is the dispute. This is what's the main issue of dispute in all of the universities. Does God create nature, or does nature create itself? Everything else flows from that are just details. And no creationists have been hammering home the fundamental issue and the fundamental question. And it's this: does God create nature, or does nature create itself? What is Stephen Hawking saying here? Nature creates itself. And how does it do it? Through spontaneous creation. Now you should be wondering, what in the world is that? I don't know. And I don't think he even knows. But it's there. He says it's spontaneous creation. In contrast to that, Stephen Meyer says, undirected materialistic causes, i.e. nature creating itself, have not demonstrated the capacity to generate significant amounts of specified information. You know what's in your DNA? Specified information. That's what's in your DNA. At the same time, conscience, intelligence, that is a real brain, has repeatedly shown itself capable of producing such information. So he's saying Hawking may believe that happens, but nobody's ever seen it happen. But what we have seen happen is real brains, real minds, real intelligence create these things. So we go back to the naturalistic side, and William Dembski sums up their point well. In naturalism, that's the view that nature creates itself. What then constrains the reproduction of living things in nature? Clearly, nature itself. Nature, as it were, selects those organisms that will reproduce and eliminates those that will not. Thus, according to Darwin, nature itself constitutes the supreme animal breeder that shapes the path of life. So nature does everything. Nature causes the mutations. Nature inflicts death. Nature selects. Nature is crafting organisms over time. Well, these two things are completely contrary explanations. And if you care about true causes, and more importantly, if you care about the Creator's glory, then this should really matter to you, whether these two things are true. So, we go back to what the Bible says. The Bible clearly declares that God creates nature. And we infer that God creates nature by the things that are made. And that's what it says in Romans chapter 1, verse 20. It says, the invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Made. We infer that we were made because, and here's the way we do it, we look at man-made things. And we know that these things don't make themselves. And we see certain features in these things. Multiple parts working together for a purpose. Does this thing have multiple parts working together for a purpose? Yes, it does. Does this have multiple parts working together for a purpose? Yes. Did this have a designer? Yes. Therefore, I infer that this had a designer. Amen. That's the biblical way of thinking. That's how it works. Do I prove that there was a designer? No. I didn't see it designed. You didn't see it designed. But then again, you didn't see this thing designed either. And you didn't even see it made. But when you look at it, you infer quite confidently that it had a designer and that it was made. And you're correct on that. And this is how, and you know what? This is at no additional charge. People are on the hook, no matter when or where they have ever lived, to come to the correct conclusion on that. The Bible says everybody will be accountable to come to the correct conclusion that living things were made. Nobody is off the hook, no matter when or where you have ever lived, or anybody's ever lived. They must come to the correct conclusion on that. Well, that stands in contrast to Stephen Hawking, who imagines that nature creates itself. That's the way he looks at it. Now, how in the world can he imagine such a thing, that nature creates itself? Well, in terms of biology, he believes that environmental stressors. You notice I'm building a whiteboard here. I'm drawing on the board. Can you see this? I'm drawing on my whiteboard. So I'm putting in these little abbreviations. Environmental stressors drive the organisms through space and time. He sees this. All the different challenges of life that have ever existed have been working on organisms, molding them and shaping them and driving them through space and time. And in their worldview, the environment runs the show. The environment is driving organisms. Let me show you some headlines from scientific papers. I know you don't read these, but they come up all the time. Insect herbivores. Those are insects that eat plants. They drive the real-time ecological evolutionary changes in plants. So plants have a challenge. It's insects that eat them, and the insects eating them is what drives their evolution in time. It's something external to them that's driving their evolution. Look at this, dry conditions. There's another challenge. Dry conditions spurred the photosynthesis of plants. The need to conserve water played a vital role in driving plants to evolve a specialized form of photosynthesis. So there you go. It doesn't tell you, it's got this big magical word here, drives them to evolve it. Well, what I really want to know is how they did it, but they don't explain how they did it. They just said it evolved it. But in their worldview, dry conditions. Dry conditions are driving these plants. Look at that. This is cave fish. Of course, the extreme environment of the cave fish is exceptional in many ways, yet environmental challenges are likely to be the driving force of many other adaptations. Goes on to say, environment controls gene expression and sex determination and other genetic disorders. It's the environment that does it. Here's another one. Natural enemies drive geographic variation in plant defenses. Here's this. Darwin's greatest discovery, mutations and selection, have jointly driven the marvelous process, leading to all different kinds of creatures, it says there on that PNAS paper. Chapter 1 of a prominent textbook. The environment. Not only the environment is driving, the environment is a what? It's an agent. It's an agent. What? Producing phenotypes. What's a phenotype? That's your whole array of traits. So if some of you are blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norwegian beauties, that's your phenotype. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norwegian beauty. That's your phenotype on those things. And if you have brown hair, brown eyes, that's your phenotype. But it's the environment as doing it, acting as an agent. Look at that. How insects drive the evolution of plants. Geology and climate drive diversification. Geological events have long been known to mold and shape biodiversity. Are you getting the picture? And that's why this textbook, Plausibility of Life, says very cogently, these are written by evolutionists, but they're right on. He, that is Darwin, accepted the view that the environment directly instructs the organism how to vary, and he proposed a mechanism for inheriting those changes. Okay, let me stop right there. You're going to see in evolutionary language, and if you don't see it, I'd like you to start seeing it, please, all kinds of magical projections onto nature, where they project onto nature human-like or God-like qualities. So, in that very first sentence here, since we have a small group and I can quiz you, where's the projection of a human-like quality? The environment, what? Directly instructs. Directly instructs the organism. This is, if I could stomp my feet on this stage, if I thought it was really solid, I would on that. This is life-changing for you as a Christian if you start seeing these things. Can the environment really instruct anything? I mean, where's the instruction book? Where do the instructions come from? How are they conveyed? Do you see what I'm saying? But you project onto nature these kind of qualities. And then once you start seeing them, you'll see this mysticism everywhere. And second, in their worldview, environments are always active. Active. And organisms are, what's the opposite of active? They are passive. Environments are active, organisms are passive. They are being molded, they are being made, they are being shaped by the environment. The organism, therefore, was what? Like modeling clay. And remolding the clay meant each of the billions of grains was free to move in any direction in which the environment what? Pushes it, makes it, and molds it. Whew. This is really important. You need to understand the naturalistic mentality. Environments exercise agency, environments have these qualities, environments are active, the organisms are passive. And the environment is molding them, making them, and shaping them. That's really, really important. This is how their view goes. Therefore, geology and climate drive diversification, which means this: the environment exercises agency, causing life's design. Whoa, really important. Because if you remember back at the very beginning of this talk, we have God exercising agency. It's agency which is able to put specified information. Now, what does it mean? As good Christians, we should know this. What does it mean to exercise agency? To exercise agency. Nobody, you haven't been asked this in Sunday school recently? Well, if not, we're wasting our time in Sunday school, because in adult Sunday school class, we should be throwing adult-like questions out. That's what we should be doing. Okay, does God exercise agency? That's an easy one. Yes. God has will. God has volition. God wants to do something, and he exercises agency. God exercises agency. Do you exercise agency? Yes, of course you do. You've got will. You've got volition. You want to do something. You want to run from this lecture. Oh, this is so hard. And if you ran out the back of the door, you would be exercising agency. Can a dog exercise agency? Of course it can. May not do it as well as we do. Maybe it does it better. But it may not do it as well, but a dog can exercise agency. Can a rock exercise agency? No, it cannot exercise agency. So this whole idea of something that is animate exercising agency may be true. But something that is inanimate, it is not true. So in their view, and this is very important because they will assert that the environment can exercise agency. Why is that important? Because they want to get God out of the picture, who does exercise agency, and they need to replace it with a false agency. And the false agency is going to be nature. Nature. That's really there. So, according to the Proceedings of the National Academy, Darwin's greatest discovery is design without a designer. Not a real designer. You take God's agency out and you substitute the phony agency of what? Nature as the phony designer. Well, that's how they see it. That's how we would look at it. Of course, we would see that God creates nature. He specifies organisms to do things. And we would expect to see within organisms specified systems, all kinds of systems within you, that enable the organism to drive themselves through space and time. So, it's the opposite. Evolutionists see environmental challenges driving organisms, and I showed you all those headlines. What if it's the exact opposite? What if it's organisms driving themselves through space and time, taking on challenges and solving those problems? You see? It's the exact opposite. Opposite. Well, if that's true, then causality would really be important. Okay, here's a gal. She was once standing up inside of her house. And now she's outside laying on the grass. Does it matter how she got there? Does it matter? No? Yes? No? Well, I guarantee you, if you're her, you probably would think it matters. According to some people, they say, well, she started in her house, she's on the grass. How does it, well, who cares how she got there? Well, one reason is she walked out her door and she went and took a nap on the grass. Another is she was clobbered on the head and drug out her door and thrown on the grass. Does it matter? It certainly matters. Yeah, you better believe it matters. It matters a lot to whether I'm here and I'm an organism and I'm being driven by my environment to here, or whether I'm here and I drive myself to here. Do you see what I'm saying? It matters a lot. It matters a whole lot of how you get there. So, we should expect to see specified systems. Well, that's how much of our whiteboard we've built. We're going to fill in the whole thing, not leaving one blank space. Anyway, so what does design analysis do for us? Well, one thing about engineers is they don't make up a lot of stories about things. It either works or it doesn't work, and they basically report just the facts. So most people are going to could refer to design analysis to look at the process the process of natural selection. How many of you have heard the process of natural selection? Well, if it's a real process, then it has real observable steps, because real processes have real observable steps. However, we don't know that. This is an historian of science. He's a British guy. He said in this book on keywords in evolutionary biology, a quite general issue has still received no canonical statement. What kind of a thing is natural selection anyway? Is it a law, a principle, a force, a cause, an agent? All or some of these things? The view that natural selection is a law has been countered by the view that it's a principle. Well, that conclusion has in turn been in the insistence that it is neither. So nobody really knows exactly what natural selection is. Well, real processes, people know what the real steps are in real processes. Here's a process. This is called the web design process for somebody who designs web pages. Guess what you see in this process? Real observable steps. You can observe the things in real processes. Here's a biological process, cellular respiration, of how you take in glucose and you end up with some energy molecules after running through this process. Are there real steps in that process? You better believe there's real observable steps in that process. Here's a process. This is called the tattoo removal process on that. Wow. There's real observable steps in this process right here, including the yelling. I mean, that's like, wow. They hurt coming, they hurt going on that. It's worse. You know from experience. I know. Oh no, you don't. Well, anyway, how would you like to have her job? Where you spend all day taking off tattoos? Wow, can you imagine the smell of burning flesh all day long? Well, anyway, the point is, real processes have real steps that you should be able to observe on that. So let's look at the adaptive process. Organisms adapt. We know that because we've had biology. Well, they have systems to express variable traits. Well, you know you have systems to express variable traits. You're not like your parents, your kids are not like yours. And then you can reproduce. That's a real process. Organisms have that. And then it's not just enough. Something has to be able to inherit those variable traits. And they have to be able to change their frequency within the population. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you go to Italy, you're probably going to see on the gals what color hair? Dark. And if you go to Sweden, you're going to see what? Blonde. That's because they have changed in their frequency within the population on that. You have a change in frequency. And that's maybe because these are either successful or failed at solving certain problems in the environment. The traits are supposed to be able to overcome conditions. Well, this is everything here are the steps in what we see in processes. So let's take it to the engineering design process. Well, this isn't fully fit, but it's close. If we were to design something, could we design something with variable traits? Of course we could. We don't generally design things to reproduce or inherit or that, but could what we design be either successful or fail? The answer is yes. And the big green O is not an O, I mean it's a big O for observable. That stands that we actually observe these things. What about when we look at organisms? Let's see, we believe organisms are designed. Do they have systems to express that? Yes. Do they reproduce? Do they inherit? Yes. Do they change in frequency? Yes. And do they solve or fail problems? Yes, they do. We observe all of these things. All of them. Well, let's take this process of natural selection. Let's see what we really observe or not observe. First, we need to define what selection is. From a biology textbook, it says, no surprise here, Darwin not only demonstrated that evolution has occurred, but also proposed its principal mechanism, natural selection. The key factor in natural selection is what? The environment. There you go. The key is the environment. The environment presents challenges. Now, here's the slight. Okay, you've been teed up. You've been teed up to see the change in causality. The environment presents challenges that individuals with particular traits can better overcome. Think about that. The environment presents what? A challenge. And then the organism, oh, baby. The organism, what does it say? The organism that has those traits better overcome it. So where does the success or failure lie? Within the organism. Within the organism. This is worth the price of admission, to be able to read literature and to figure out what's true and what's phony. Because this is true. The environment is a challenge. This is true. I have traits that can either solve the challenge or it doesn't solve the challenge. This is phony. Thus, the environment selects which organisms will survive and reproduce. Do you see the phoniness there? Here's the challenge. I just solved it. I succeeded. And then they say, oh, it selected me. It selected me. You're going to see this in every one of these definitions. Natural selection. Does natural selection cause changes in the environment? No. Natural selection is the environment. Oh, it is the environment. How about this one? In the classical view of evolution, species experience spontaneous genetic mutations that produce various novel traits, some helpful and some detrimental. That's all true. So you have variety. Some work, some don't. Nature then selects for the most beneficial, passing them on to subsequent generations. False. Traits either succeed or they fail. Go back to my very beginning analogy. The rocket is going into space by what? Natural projection, but then I define it in terms of its own internal abilities. Really, really important on that. So, when we look at natural selection, we see all of these observable things, except they don't know whether they're going to attribute the success or failure to the organism or whether they're going to give credit to nature. But what about this agency thing? What about the so-called selection event? Does nature have a brain? Can it exercise agency, volition? And I talked about this quite a bit yesterday. Well, let's think about that. Can nature really do those kinds of things? Well, if nature is going to be driven by environmental stressors, in natural selection, what is the selection event? What is the selection event? And in natural selection, it's always going to be what? Death. Death. Now this, as a Christian, you should be wondering, wow, is God really going to use death like this? Is God going to be really using death to make selections? Is death really going to be God's mechanism for life's change agent? I mean, you should be thinking about that quite seriously. Look what it says in this textbook, Ecological Development. Death is selective. I put that on because it's the shortest one I could find. That's pretty succinct. Death is selective. You guys over here, you don't have the traits. You're dead. Your genes are out of the gene pool. You guys do. You live. Your genes are in. And there you go. And then another stressor comes by, and you guys live, but you're dead. Oh, man. It's just when you thought you were favored, you became disfavored. Oh, by the way, favored. Can environments favor? Oh, don't you say that all the time? This was favored. This was favored by the environment. Death is selective. How many of you know this guy, Steve Jobs? President of Apple, CEO. He's now dead. He got liver cancer. No, he got pancreatic cancer. Worse, pancreatic cancer. He gave a commencement address at Stanford University right before, a couple years before he died, and he said this: death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. I mean, think about that. Is that true or perverse? It's totally perverse. But in this naturalistic worldview where nature creates itself, you have to be able to differentiate between organisms, i.e. select. And the way you select is some of them always have to die. And so that is that. And of course, Himmelfarb, talking about Darwin, he saw the cruelty of nature as part of a larger, beneficent, that means good, kind, design. So Darwin didn't always totally eliminate the designer, but he thought maybe the designer, if there was one, was using death as part of a bigger picture. A bigger picture in which he's really doing, in the big picture, good, but on an individual basis, he's killing them off on that. Do you see what I'm saying? He's looking at it, he's trying to reconcile the two. And therefore, even creationists, in their publications, they state stuff like this. God is able to make good come out of even death itself. I'm going to assert that this is a rationalization, because this person holds to natural selection. Natural selection, though what? Fueled by death. I hope you have a whole new appreciation of this whole concept of selection. It is always 100% of the time fueled by death. Well, it helps the population by getting rid of genetic defects. You know what that's saying? That's a type of eugenics. That's a type of eugenics. You guys, sorry over here, you guys get to do all of us except for that row there, because my wife is in it, on there. You guys get to do us all a big favor, because you're carrying genetic defects. And therefore, the favor you can do for the rest of us is you can what? Die. Aren't you glad they died? Because now their bad genes are what? Gone. And they're no longer dragging us down as a human race. This is just eugenics thinking dressed up in Christian verbiage. That's all it is. I mean, is this really how the Lord Jesus Christ operates? Or does he say in 1 Corinthians 15, death is what? An enemy.
Yes.
Enemy. It is the what? Last enemy. Oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting? The sting of death is the law, but praise be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. This is not something that, please do us a favor and die. It's an enemy. It's an enemy that needs to be destroyed. How many of you guys have been duped into this before this lecture? Maybe thinking in natural selection. Selection's the way to do it. So, the environment exercises agency, causing life's design, because it eliminates everything. So do you see how they view it? Nature dispenses mutations, cosmic rays, bad chemicals, radiation, whatever, mutates you. So it changes you. And then it eliminates and it selects. Nature is doing everything. Nature is active, organisms are passive. Wow. Well, is that really true? Is nature really making these selections or not? Well, let's go back to this history of natural selection. This is a very interesting quote. That no one would easily or inadvertently slip into talking of nature as a realm where anything like selection was located. And indeed, we find few authors before Darwin making that transition. That's just a little snippet. But what they're saying is this. Prior to Darwin's writing of Origin of Species, hardly any author would have ever ascribed selective capacity to nature. Nobody would have written that way because they knew that nature cannot what? Really select. But after Darwin, who said nature could select, all kinds of authors came in. But people didn't accept this right away. Here's a quote. Darwin published in 1859, Origin of the Species, and this was a quote from 1864 by the French Perpetual Secretary of the French Academy of Sciences. In 1864, look what he said. Jean-Pierre Fleurens described Darwin's Origin of the Species as, quote, metaphysical jargon thrown in mist in the natural history, pretentious and empty, silly language, silly and supernatural personifications, and stated that Darwin, quote, "Imagine afterwards that this power of selecting which he gives to nature is similar to the power of man." This is only 5 years after Darwin wrote it, and this French Academy guy is saying what Darwin wrote is what? Rubbish. It's silly. Nobody would give this power to select. But I submit to you, by 2016, loads of people think it happens all the time. Loads of people engage in personifications. Loads of people say nature favors and does all these things. Well, there was a lot of people who pushed back on this. It's kind of a long quote, but look at the date, 1954. This guy's a thorough evolutionist. He's Scottish. He said, please bear with this long quote, but it's important. It is important to note that in all these processes, there is what? No selection in the proper meaning of the word. It is unfortunate that Darwin ever introduced the term natural selection, for it has given rise to much confusion of thought. He did so, of course, because he arrived at his theory through studying the effects of selection practiced by man, in the breeding of domesticated animals and cultivated plants. Here the use of the word is entirely legitimate. But the action of man in selective breeding is not analogous to the action of natural selection, but it's almost its direct opposite. Nothing of this kind happens or can happen through the blind process of differential elimination and blah, 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 which he called natural selection. He's pointing out that this is a silly analogy. Let me show you how silly it is. Let's say we have a space shuttle that's coming back to land on Earth. And it's going to go through that atmosphere. And when it goes through the atmosphere, what happens to the space shuttle? It gets very, very hot. And then at the bottom of it, they have these heat shields, these little tiles that are heat shields. Well, this one lands successfully. And you're my boss. You're the chief engineer, and I'm the working engineer. And you ask me, well, why did that one land successfully? And I said, well, the atmosphere, it's selected for this one. And then, unfortunately, this one burned up over Texas. And everybody was killed. And then you ask me, well, why did that one burn up? And I say, well, the atmosphere selected against it. How long would I have my job? You know, in medicine, would you want me to use these kinds of explanations for your diseases? In engineering, would you want me to use this explanation? Then why do we tolerate these kind of explanations in biology? Why is this a legitimate explanation in biology for things when we wouldn't tolerate it in any other realm? I guarantee you, this is how I would explain it. The atmosphere produced a lot of energy. We had a heat shield. One of the heat tiles fell off during the launch, which allowed it to burn through, causing an explosion, blah, 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 blah. And I would find the environmental condition, I would find the exact thing that failed, and I would tie it right back to that. Why don't I do the same thing in biology? When there's a drought, and here's a drought, and this plant is living in the drought, and I say, well, here's the features on the plant that solve the problem of the drought. Here's the genetics and the epigenetics behind those traits, and that explains it. And have I referred to anything mystical or magical? None. It's a lot better than saying, well, this one was favored, and these were not favored. This is the magic. And this is what's leading people to think that somehow nature creates itself. Design analysis shows that problems don't select their solutions. Things either succeed or fail. That's the way it is in man-made engineering. That's the way it is in God's design. And you know what? A design, because something fails as a design doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad design. I won't go into that, but just think about it. Do humans make and design things on purpose to purposely fail? Yes, we do. We do it all the time. Of course we do. If you're driving up the road right now in your car, 5 minutes. Are you kidding me? Dr. Hawking gave me a 7. So, and you hit an abutment, what happens to the front of your car? It gets mangled on purpose. It crumples and crushes in a very specified way. And the engine gets driven down into the ground and not into the back seats. We design things to fail on purpose lots of times on that. We design those things to happen. So yes, it does. We design things to sometimes wear out on purpose, not just to sell more. So familiar claims to the contrary notwithstanding, Darwin didn't manage to get mental causes out of his account. He just hid them in selective breeding by natural selection. Do you know we started it at a quarter till also? I looked because I could see it right here on my clock, on my thing. If you're a speaker, you look at those things on that. You see this little clock right here. I saw it. It was a quarter till. I tell you. That's your poor daughter. All right. So, with this, guess what? That's undetectable. That's undetectable. Wow, we have a lot of undetectable things, and let's go to this last baby. Selective pressures. Those things which are supposedly pressuring and changing all kinds of creatures on that. Selective pressures. In a long quote by a thorough evolutionist in his book, What Evolution Is. But look at what he says. This may be your final test, since time is running out. In the evolutionary discussions, someone asks the question, in his question and answer part in the back, what is a selective pressure? They ask a question, what's a selective pressure? Good question. He answers it. In evolutionary discussions, it is often stated that selection pressure resulted in the success or elimination of certain characteristics. Evolutionists here have used terminology from the physical sciences. What is meant, of course, is simply the consistent lack of success of certain phenotypes and their elimination from the population result in the observed changes in a population. It must be remembered that the use of words like force or pressure is strictly metaphorical, and that there is no force or pressure connected with selection as there is in discussion of the physical sciences. Wow, that's an interesting, wasn't that good? So the bottom line, is there really a selective pressure? The answer is no. It's purely a metaphor. And again, what he's really looking at is whether the organism that has a specific trait is either successful or what? Unsuccessful. That's all he's looking at. It's natural projection all over again. That's what the organisms can do or what they can't do. Wow, that's really important. So, in terms of a quantifiable pressure, whether there's really a force that can actually act on creatures and which can actually drive them through space and time, some pressure that can actually push them along, the answer is that is also undetectable. It's not really there. And of course, if we just fill in the rest of our chart, this is what we see. We see some things that are clearly observable, but we see some things that are clearly unobservable. And selection and selective pressures are only happening in someone's mind. They're not really out there. They're not really measurable. Nobody really sees selection. All they see is something die. So therefore, we have an observable part and an undetectable part. What we observe are these real things in creatures which enable them to drive themselves through space and time. This is what we really observe. And when we look at all of this undetectable stuff that nobody really knows or nobody really can observe, what those are human projections onto nature where they exercise agency. How do we see this manifested in evolutionary literature or even creationist literature? Look what Darwin says and what Jerry Coyne says and why evolution is true. Natural selection, we find, is everywhere, scrutinizing individuals, culling the unfit, and promoting the genes of the fitter. It can create intricate adaptations, sometimes in surprisingly little time. Okay, quiz question number 2. Do you see any personifications there? Is it one massive personification? Natural selection is where? Everywhere. This is more than a personification. It's a deification. Can you see that? Are you everywhere? No. Is Satan everywhere? No. Who's everywhere? God's everywhere. But now, natural selection is what? Everywhere. And not only is natural selection everywhere, what does it see? According to this. Everything. It's everywhere. It sees everything. It's scrutinizing individuals. Wow. Now it can scrutinize. It culls. What is culling? Culling is when you weed out. But do you cull everything, or do you only cull certain things? You only cull certain things because you're making a selection. So culling is an act of making a decision, and it promotes the genes. So it is everywhere, scrutinizing, culling, promoting, and creating. Can everybody see that this is like the substitute God that is in nature? Here's a creationist journal. What if the environment did select organisms? Would this really steal credit from the Lord? The creator of organisms is also the creator of the environment. He gets the glory from both. I would submit to you, God did create nature, but he did not create nature to exercise agency. And when you say if the environment does what? Select, then you're projecting agency on it. And this is a subtle way which we don't want to be tossed to and fro and carried about in all the sleight of men. I'll skip this quote. Basically, what this guy, who's a thorough evolutionist, says is that Darwin provided an atheistic view of nature, but he really didn't make it truly atheistic. He just took God out and put a substitute mystical God in. That's paraphrasing what he said here. And there. Wow. Since this is a creationist journal. Since he created the environment, does he not get the glory when the environment exercises agency as well? Sounds kind of theological, but totally wrong. Well, we ascribe this agency unto God. Therefore, this is the bottom line. This is rational mysticism. Rational mysticism. And we need to be really aware of that. Really aware of that. So, in conclusion, let me ask you some questions. Let's just see if you hung with me with this quote. Is there anything in nature equivalent to a human brain to justify using the word nature selects? No. Is there any scientific paper out there where a scientist has actually observed nature to select?
No.
No. Is there any scientific paper out there which actually measures a selective pressure? No. All of these things are happening in people's minds. This is a sleight of hand. Organisms were created by God with innate abilities to self-adjust to all different kinds of conditions. Let's look here before the fall. Before the fall, no death. When organisms produce a trait which solves an environmental problem, that organism moves into that niche. It's not pushed in, it's not selected for, it's not favored. It fills the niche. What happened to these organisms that didn't make the trait? See, you guys have a hard time getting your brain out of death and struggle. They're still there. There you go. That's it. They're still there. They didn't go anywhere, and they didn't die. They just stayed in this niche. Do you see what I'm saying? And then organisms make it. They move into it. And then maybe some from that population or some from this population will move into another niche. And then they'll move into another niche. And pretty soon organisms will be fruitful, multiply, and what? Fill the earth. Okay. That was before the fall. Those same mechanisms which allowed organisms to do this before the fall are the same mechanisms at work after the fall. So now, there's a challenge out there. Some of these organisms produce traits that solve the challenge. They fill the niche. Now it's post-fall. What about these organisms? They're still there. That's option number one. Or option number two is that some of them may have died. Some of them may have died. That's what happens post-fall. A challenge is just another, death is just another challenge to overcome. And some of these, unfortunately, died. And some of them didn't. That's what happens post-fall. But organisms are still using the same mechanisms to drive themselves through space and time in order to fill the earth. And all personifications of favoring, acting on, working on, scrutinizing, culling, weeding out, blah, 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 blah. Those are all personifications and projections of human likability onto nature, which ultimately robs God of his glory. And how an organism gets from here to here is really important. Really important. Amen? Well, hopefully this has changed your perspective. I guarantee you, tonight's lecture will be easier. Will be easier. So, I'll see you again tonight. Pastor?
We're going to take just about a 10, 15-minute break, and we'll be back here at about 5:02. So there's still some coffee over there, book tables over here, restrooms out there. See you in about 5, 10 minutes.